Over the course of the last 25 years, Polyvinyl Record Company has grown from an idea in the heads of two excitable music fans into one of the more versatile and artistically driven record labels of its kind, working with a roster of well over 100 artists and consistently pushing independent music in new directions. In commemoration of this landmark birthday, we've put together the Polyvinyl Podcast to chronologically tell the story of how polyvinyl has evolved over the last quarter of a century. I'm your host, Fred Thomas, and I've been a friend of the labels since the early 2000s. Along with Polyvinyl staffers Natalie Davila, Andy DeSantis, and Seth Hubbard, we sat down and talked to just some of the folks who have been part of each of Polyvinyl's various phases, conducting dozens of interviews and piecing together an oral history of the label from first-hand accounts and collective memories. With each episode, we'll get deep into every era, moving from DIY beginnings to where the label is at today, and looking at how Polyvinyl and their family of artists have navigated the ever-changing music industry while holding on to core beliefs of positivity, kindness, and good music for all you good people. Hello, and welcome back to the Polyvinyl Podcast. In our last episode, we talked about how Polyvinyl began in the early 90s, growing from a few high school kids putting on shows and making zines into a label that quickly gained momentum and helped bring some of the most important documents of the Midwestern emo scene of that time into existence. If you haven't checked that episode out already, it would be a good place to start, as we covered a lot of what happened in that embryonic stage. Right around when the 90s ended and the aughts began, Polyvinyl was still very much a fledgling label, with founders Matt and Darcie Lunsford putting all of their energy into its progression and seeking out new artists for their growing roster. Bands like Braid, Rainer Maria, American Football, and other acts connected to the earliest days of Polyvinyl were some of the definitive names of Midwestern emo, the emotionally guided and often poetic, impressionistic subgenre that mutated out of hardcore and took on even more specific nuances in different regions. The music that fell under this banner could differ wildly from one band or area to the next, but many of the bands were connected by their shared roots in punk, whether that meant the revolutionary sounds or ideological beliefs that the music carried. An already hard to pin down genre was changing quickly by the end of the 90s. Bowling Green, Ohio band Aloha was one of the more exciting mutations from this time, incorporating elements of improvisation and uncommon compositional and arrangement choices into their emo-adjacent sound. Here's Aloha's Tony Cavallario talking about signing on with Polyvinyl and being the only band at the Hardcore Fest with a vibraphone.
When we went on tour, those shows were house shows, they were all ages spaces. It was definitely punk. I mean, I don't know how else to say it. So something that was really cool is that we would show up with weird instruments, and it wasn't that many bands doing it at the time. Looking back on it now, I can see other bands that were doing a similar thing, but at the time it was just like, oh, you guys are doing something weird. Okay, cool. Why don't you play at 1 o'clock or whatever? The whole aesthetic of the band and the band name, Aloha, it was supposed to be thought of as like, what does this look like if it's silkscreened on a canvas patch? What does it look like, on the lineup of like a festival with 12 bands named like Ass Munch? You know what I mean? Right. So like...
It's such a long time ago that I forget that my very scrappy punk band, Lovesick, we did a very long, very, very, very punk tour together, playing all ages house shows and really just like any show. And you guys were setting up a vibraphone every night. At the time, it all felt kind of like, oh yeah, this is what punk is right now.
Yeah, for sure. It was its own thing to be an indie rock band that existed in the hardcore punk domain.
As a personal aside, Tony and I go way, way back. We did some of our very first tours together, collaborated on music off and on over the years. I even sang a song at his wedding. But my initial introduction to Tony and his band Aloha was when their demo tape showed up on my doorstep unsolicited. I got a package at my P.O. box that had a tape of the stuff that became the Aloha 7-inch that we put out together. And the letter was maybe from Matthew Gengler, the bass player, and it was really super gregarious. And I think it ended with a kind of like, not pushy, but like very assertive thanks in advance kind of sign off. Because he was like, hey, we're going to put out this 7-inch. It's already pretty much at the plant. It would be great to have it be on your label in name alone. Like you can just actually put a sticker with your label on the 7 inches and we'll send you some and you can help us with distro. It was sort of like, this is going to happen with or without you, so you might as well be on board for it.
That whole story is just funny to me because I think that's just something that Matthew did. Like, I don't think we ever had a big talk about it. That's a beautiful thing just to think about how random that is.
Aloha didn't use quite the same thanks in advance approach with Polyvinyl.
Matt was like, yeah, we're looking for records to put out. It's probably worth telling that when I sent out the demo, I said something about our music is a cross between early Genesis and Red House Painters. And
wow.
And
you really sold it.
and I think that sounds like a ridiculous thing to say. It's amazing that it worked. Those are my people, Rainer Maria, Braid, the Kinsellas. I had not met those people. Those were the people that I was looking up to the most. I remember there was a festival in Columbus, More Than Music Fest. Like, I was one of the kids watching Rainer Maria crying, you know? Like, just like, this is my favorite band. This is my emotional, like, wavelength I'm on. I'm dying watching this band. Probably a year later, we were playing with them at CMJ, and they were like everything that I hoped that they would be in terms of embracing us. It was kind of magical. There's also something, I can't really put it into words, but there's something approachable about the whole Polyvinyl and that whole scene at the time. There was a sense that I can do what they're doing. To me, that's what's punk about it. When you see a punk band, that's your signal that you can do this no matter what your proficiency level is. It's a spiritual thing. And likewise, the other direction is that you have a label that basically doesn't have a super over-defined sound, then you can be among that and you can, do whatever you want.
The scene Polyvinyl was documenting in the Midwest was growing concurrently with other independent music scenes across the U.S. Over in Florida, Laura Jane Grace had recently started her new band Against Me around the same time Polyvinyl had begun. And there was a kind of cross-pollination of ideas happening even in those early times. Here's Laura.
I guess that I was aware of Polyvinyl without first being aware that I was aware of the label. If that makes sense. Late 90s, early 2000s, I lived in Gainesville, Florida, and I had a roommate who was really, really into Braid. And at the same time, I was really into Rainer Maria. So I was, aware of both of those bands without being really aware of what labels they were on, or I guess even really perception-wise of where they were from in the country, right? But I remember with Braid that it was like this thing where it was like a big deal when they broke up as a band and became Hey Mercedes. And I remember there was like a box set that came out for Braid that when my roommate at the time got it, it was like, it was held in extreme reverence. Like, oh no, you don't understand. This is like the Braid box set, they were held in a very certain light that I understood was distinct than other bands or other scenes.
Turn it up, 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 turn it up. Give me one time. Turn it up, turn it up, turn it up, turn it up.
As the label's reach grew, so did its scope. As the 2000s dawned, Polyvinyl began working with bands based outside of the Midwestern region where they had gotten their start. East Coast acts AM/FM and Matt Pond PA joined the roster, as did Los Angeles emo pop band Sunday's Best. One of the most notable examples of this geographical branching out was Mates Estate. Working out of the Bay Area, the two-piece band consisting of married couple Corey Gardner and Jason Hamill were making a distinctive kind of pop music that was somehow minimal and enormous at the same time. With infectiously hooky songs consisting of just drums, keyboards, and interlocking vocal harmonies, Mates of State didn't fit neatly in any specific category, and sounded unlike anything Polyvinyl had released up until that point. The band's California address and regional popularity from heavy touring up and down the West Coast only added to making their inclusion on the label in 2002 feel like an expansion. Here's Corey and Jason remembering their decision to sign on with Polyvinyl.
We were living in San Francisco at the time, and we had just released our first album, my solo project, under Omnibus Records, like a local Sacramento, San Francisco label. And then we were like, we should make another record and maybe consider going on tour.
And we didn't really know much about Polyvinyl, except for we're like, oh, they're from the Midwest, and we were from Kansas, so.
And Minnesota.
I mean, but we went to school. We made the band in Kansas. That was where we started.
I think Matt came to a show at Bottom of the Hill. It was the first time I remember meeting him.
I remember going out to eat, and I feel like Matt and Darcie both came, and to me, that sold it. Because they're awesome. Yeah. Matt and Darcie I was like, I would be friends with them. They're cool. They're super positive.
Like, they were just like authentic people. They weren't like, you've had like those meetings with labels where they're like, do you want to be the biggest band in the world? Get you there. And then, like that was not their approach. They were like, we like your music. It was almost like too casual.
We liked that they were like, we want to branch out. We were like, that's cool because, we'll help branch out to the West. And like, I feel like after that, they did kind of get more, they reached out to more like poppy, different avenues of bands. They started putting out people from different parts of the country and like, not just like a straight emo rock sound.
Here's Matt Lunsford.
Mate was one of the first artists that we worked with. Wasn't from the immediate scene, and they had already been somewhat established before we started working. It was like right as we were making our transition from being this husband and wife label in Danville to like growing and starting to have, additional people helping us out.
Working with Polyvinyl added a new level of organization to Mates Estate's career, but the most important part of their label-band relationship was something much more fundamental.
Now, just like thinking about it, there's two things that they really brought to the table aside from distribution in stores, and it was like radio, college radio. I remember they had this like deal where they would send out all our stuff to college radio stations and they would start playing it. So when we go to the show, the music was already there and in people's ears. And then number two was like the first time it was like, you hire a publicist to like get you, magazine write-ups and weeklies and all that kind of stuff. Someone that's like constantly working on it. So it was just like this coordinated effort to like tell people.
Which we didn't know anything about. I mean, we really were very much like
we're just
do everything on our own. If we meet someone, they want to have an interview, we'll go have an interview. Like it was way more of a system, I guess, that we didn't know anything about really.
And they facilitated all that. We were just like, we're going to play a show every night. We'll be at the show. What else can we do to build that? And they were like, okay, here's what you got to do. They coordinated all of that extra stuff that really hyped up the show. Yeah. And then ultimately the record.
Well, and I will say this, the main thing they did was like our music. Like that's like, I think about people going on like, major labels or even small labels that like, you have to have people that would listen to your music aside from whether or not they were working for you. The new music that we'd give them, they'd be like, awesome, this is great.
And we're like, are you thinking about a single or any of that stuff? It was just like, give us the record, let's go.
Like full support. Yeah. They're music fans. Like they like this music, Yeah, and let me tell you, there's a lot of people along the way that you work with that like, I don't think they've listened to our music. You're like, wait, have you been to a show? Like,
or people that you've worked with for a while, and you look at, I remember like, I'm not going to name names, but you look in their iPod, and they don't even have your record in their iPod back when you were.
You're like, you're supposed to be liking this. Like, if you don't, tell us now.
You can wait all night, I'll never stop complaining. As I look into those eyes, I can't behave. 'Cause this song's not right, it's a legend that you're after.
Another monumental addition to the Polyvinyl family happened in 2002 when Bloomington Normal Jr. Seth Hubbard began interning for the label to complete his degree. Little did anyone know it then, but Seth would keep working with Polyvinyl for years to come, moving from intern to someone who did a little bit of everything, and eventually solidifying his role as the label director. Here's Seth telling the story of how he first got involved.
I grew up in Bloomington Normal, where I went to school as well. Was super into sports, specifically basketball. My dad is a basketball coach, or was. He's retired now. My grandpa was as well. Me and my other two brothers all played basketball for my dad in high school. And it wasn't until like freshman year of high school that music started to take over. And I've thought about this over time. And I think the reason it hit so hard was it was something that was truly mine in a way, where like basketball was like a family thing, sports were a family activity, and music could be this thing that like I had. I would say it was like my freshman year of college. I started working at the college radio station. No, I went to school in Bloomington Normal, which is 45 minutes away from Champaign. So I met Matt and Darcie because like the main radio promoter that we always worked with, I needed an internship for my degree, and I was like, do you know any record labels that need interns? And he was like, Matt and Darcie, who run Polyvinyl, just moved from Danville to Champaign. What about that? And so he gave me an intro to Matt, and I remember coming for an interview in Matt's basement and then got the internship. That was 2002. My junior year, I did an internship with Polyvinyl, and then went back for my senior year. And like when I left the internship, Darcie was always like, come work for us when you're done with school. And so I kept in touch with them my senior year, and then by springtime, I was like, you serious about the job? And it worked out. So I moved to Champaign in August of 03, started at the beginning of September. I was supposed to be the radio promotions guy when I got hired. But then on day one, I showed up and Matt was like, oh, our in-house publicist quit a couple weeks ago. You're going to be doing publicity too. It's pretty much like radio, but you'll do that as well. And I was like, oh, I don't know anything about this. I've never done PR. I didn't go to school for it. I was just like, okay, show me what to do. Now it's okay, we're hiring PR for every record. And back then, it was only like the really big stuff, like the new Raina Maria, the new Mates of State would get like a publicist on board. But then it was the other stuff was like thrown to me to do. And like the Decibel record was like, I think the first record I ever worked, it was like right after I began. And I'm like, I've got to be your publicist, and I don't totally know what that means right now. And yeah, it was just like learning on the job.
Seth's tireless work is one of the main driving factors of everything that's happened with Polyvinyl since he first came on board, and his humble nature means he's probably going to ask me to edit this part out of the podcast narration. But truth be told, this podcast, multiple band signings, and many, many other Polyvinyl projects wouldn't have happened without Seth's guidance and commitment. He's going to be helping out with some of these interviews as we go along as well. It was 2003 when I came into the picture, when Polyvinyl signed my project, Saturday Looks Good to Me, and released our most fully realized album, All Your Summer Songs. The release of the album represented a further stylistic shift for Polyvinyl. Even though I'd first been introduced to the label through shows my emo punk band Lovesick had played with Aloha and Raina Maria, SLGTM was a very different thing. A mercurial concept band with a rotating cast of singers and musicians, and lo-fi recordings that mixed melancholy indie pop songwriting with the production influence of Motown, the Beach Boys, and oldies radio. Here's part of a conversation I had with Seth Hubbard and Andy DeSantis about the unusual paths that led me to working with Polyvinyl, and how so much of it felt like a surreal dream. Saturday Looks Good to Me started out just like me in a basement recording, and it was never supposed to be a band. It was never supposed to play a live show. It was just sort of like something I was doing for fun. And in a very quick succession, it was like, I'm going to press up some records. Oh, and then we got asked to go on tour. Can you assemble a band and go on tour? And then Aloha and some of the people from Raina Maria played the record for Matt and Darcie, and they came out and saw us on that tour. And it all just felt like this weird dream. It really went quickly from, this is just like an idea I've got hanging out at home, eating snacks, recording, to run a label, and people are listening to it. And the music at that time was a little bit dreamlike, for sure. So it fit that these sort of like surreal, unexpected experiences were coming along with it.
Yeah, I mean, I also remember around that time, like harder, like screamo bands were like big. I remember Thursday was like really big, that whole thing. And then that's another reason why I think hearing All Your Summer Songs was like, oh my God, this is like a breath of fresh air kind of. And it was different, but familiar at the same time. It's like how when people heard Aloha for the first time, it was like, whoa, this is like different. There's a vibraphone. What's going on? It being on Polyvinyl, I kind of got that same feeling with All Your Summer Songs being on Polyvinyl.
That makes perfect sense because I was playing in Lovesick and we're playing all these kind of hardcore shows. And Lovesick wasn't aggressive. It was just really fast and jittery. And I would go home after these shows and just listen to Motown records and be like, I can vibe with this because I can't really find a community with these aggressive expressions. And I felt like at the time I was like, Motown's like strangely more politically sharp than a lot of these like people who are like vaguely screaming about their feelings. Like I felt like Motown was like very direct, and I wanted to have that sort of like direct personal expression in a very like beautiful, fun, uplifting sound.
One of the other things that's, I think, an early Saturday thing that I would just love to hear your take on, and it's something that I know Matt speaks of fondly. I think he brought all your summer songs to a tour you were on. Like, he had your records and he brought them for you, and you were seeing them for the first time.
It wasn't even a show that I played.
Oh.
I think it was a Mates Estate show in Chicago. So I drove from Ann Arbor, where I was living, to Chicago. And I don't think I expected the records to be done that soon. And it really did strike me. I'm doing stuff that I only ever thought other people did. I'm like driving to Chicago to see this band I like a lot, and my label's going to be there. What the fuck? I have a label? Mm-hmm. And they're going to bring this CD that like I didn't have to save money to put out and beg people to listen to. It felt so validating, and it felt a little bit like I was getting away with something. It still feels like that every time I make a record, every time I make music. Like Andy, I remember like when we met up at South by Southwest in 2015, you had copies of my record All Are Saved, and you took a picture, and I looked like a very like unwell person. But it was a sincere feeling of, holy fuck, this happened again. I keep on getting away with making this music, and people actually listen to it.
I think I have a photo of that, actually.
I know you do. It's not the most flattering photo in the world, but it's a real thing. And it's that feeling of like truly feeling like appreciated and validated and believed in. It's pretty rare for any artist, and definitely that was one of the first times it struck me with gravity. During this interview, I remembered something from that time that somehow I'd never shared with either Seth or Andy in all these years. In the time when Saturday was starting to play shows and I was finished All Your Summer Songs, and I was looking for a label to put it out. Like, the record was done for a long time, like a year and a half. And that was around like end of 2001, start of 2002. And the White Stripes were like a pretty big deal. The White Stripes were a pretty big deal everywhere. But that was getting to the point where labels were starting to come to Detroit to find the next White Stripes. So I remember I got a call. It might have been like the fall of 2001. It's like, hey, we need you to come play the show tomorrow night because Seymour Stein from Sire Records is going to be in town, and he wants to see all of the Detroit bands that are doing something right now. And I was like, okay, fuck yeah. Seymour Stein signed the Smiths. He signed Fleetwood Mac. He signed the Ramones. Like, I want to be in the same room as that guy. He's going to see my band? Yes, I'll play that show. So we played the show, and Seymour Stein was an older dude. He's like probably like in his 60s at that point, and he jumped up and like came to the front of the stage when we started playing and was stoked. And the next day, he took me out to dinner. I was just starstruck as fuck. He was like, okay, I'm not going to sign your band to Sire because I can see that you have a ways to go, but I'm going to stay in touch with you. I'm going to keep my eyes on you. And he did. For the next like few years, he would call me on the phone every once in a while, and he'd come to see my shows whenever he was in town. And right around the time that I had met Matt and Darcie, I got a call from him, and he was like, okay, your record that you sent me a year ago, like, we're going to put it out in this new sub-label. It's like our major label version of an indie label. And we're going to see how that goes. And when that record does good, or if it does good, like, then we can talk about making a jump, and we'll get you a manager and all that stuff. And I was like, Mr. Stein, thank you, but I'm going to work with this label Polyvinyl because I met them, and they seem like they're really excited about it, and like we've already talked, and it's going to be a good thing. And yeah, I was young and super excitable, but I was like, oh yeah, you're going to put me on your like fake indie label and see how it does. I know that's not going to work in my favor as an artist. Everything about that read to me as a compromise, and I was like, that's not punk. That's not what I want. I know how that story ends, so I turned him down and signed with Polyvinyl.
When they started counting down, I could not believe you were fast asleep. Have faith in the blue lady. Have faith.
At the same time the label was growing in new directions both musically and across time zones, they were also continuing to move forward with the artists they'd been growing with from the beginning. Polyvinyl had put out the debut releases from both post-Brady incarnation Hey Mercedes and Owen, the solo project from American football's Mike Kinsella. Rainer Maria had been consistently burning brightly since the label began, touring and releasing new music practically without pause. Their 2003 album, Long Knives Drawn, would be their most successful album up until that point, thanks in no small part to their ferocious work ethic, and willingness to hit the road.
In the blue, lady, have faith, have faith. Come disconnect the dots with me, Poppin'. Come disconnect the dots. Come disconnect the dots with me, Poppin'. Come disconnect.
The first few years of the 2000s found Polyvinyl growing into a label that wasn't confined to any one style or aesthetic, and this progression was solidified completely in 2004 with the release of Satanic Panic in the Attic, the sixth full-length album from Athens, Georgia's of Montreal, and their first release with Polyvinyl. Centered around the songwriting and musical personality of vocalist, multi-instrumentalist Kevin Barnes, of Montreal had been steadily active since the late 90s, making psychedelically tinged indie pop. The group was connected with the Elephant Six Collective, a cluster of musicians deeply influenced by the more kaleidoscopic side of 60s pop, and their early sound was very much in line with that musical identity. Something changed with Satanic Panic, though, as Kevin began looking more to 80s new wave, Afrobeat, and Prince as inspirations for their meticulously constructed and always captivating pop songs. Here's Kevin talking about that shift, and how it happened at the same time of Montreal got connected with Polyvinyl.
We found ourselves without a label, and we had put out 5 records on a couple different labels. Didn't want to really necessarily work with any of those people again. We were looking for somebody else to work with. And I was talking to Eric Carter, our booking agent. I think the connection at that point was Mates of State was on Polyvinyl, and they were also booked by Eric at that time too. So, and knowing that they had had some success with some other records was also something that drew us towards them, and just liking them as people as well, just feeling like they were on the same wavelength. Yeah, that was also an interesting time in the band's history, just because it was the end of one chapter and the beginning of another chapter. Like the people that I've been with, a bunch of them had sort of dropped off and didn't really know what was going to happen with the band. I knew I still wanted to keep making music, but I didn't really know, because like up to that point we hadn't had any commercial success and no real reason to think that it would ever happen. So just kind of like, well, I have a lot of new ideas and I want to, keep pursuing music, and whatever, these guys aren't going to work with me anymore. That's fine. I'll just, figure it out. So it was kind of like a cool rebirth in a sense, because like starting with Polyvinyl, it was like a fresh beginning and a fresh start. And then like working in a slightly new genre, doing some programmed drumming for the first time with Disconnect the Dots and Rapture Apes the Muses, and sort of like experimenting with different kind of sounds, different approaches. It was almost like, kind of like being born again artistically, and then also working with this new group of people in Polyvinyl was really exciting. So yeah, it just felt like, oh yeah, this is actually something that seems positive and powerful, and I felt very optimistic. Stepping away from the 60s nostalgia thing that we were obsessed with leading up to Satanic Panic. I think that with Satanic Panic, it was like, okay, now there's all these new doors that are opening up to me artistically, where I don't need to feel like it has to sound like this very specific thing, like the Kinks or the Who or whatever. Like it can also sound like Duran Duran or whatever else that the influence might be. And there was so much excitement just in my own part as a writer and a producer, and that freedom that was very inspiring, because it was like all of a sudden I had access to all these new reference points.
Here's Darcie and Matt Lunsford talking about their decision to sign Of Montreal, a band very much unlike anything Polyvinyl had taken on before.
There's just something about the demo that they sent. It was just weird, and it was happy, and it was just all over the place. And I thought, man, this is different than anything else that Polyvinyl's put out. And I really liked him. He was on the fence.
There's this little bit of hesitation of like, oh, is this a little too different than we've done in the past? And Darcie was just like, no, let's get over that and just go. That was a turning point. When we put out Satanic Panic, Darcie really leaned into the idea that like, we don't need to be any one kind of label.
Well, no, I just thought we sign who we like. We like their music.
Here's Seth Hubbard.
I think the Of Montreal signing was like a very symbolic thing where it was like, okay, we can do other stuff. Like we can branch out a little bit and have something that's completely different from like the roots. And I remember for a lot of years there, I was just like, we're not an emo label. We're other stuff too. So whenever we would get pigeonholed as the emo label, I'm like, but we're not anymore. So yeah, I think the Of Montreal one was like the big shift. And then when that became a runaway success, you start to try and get other bands that are of a similar ilk and try to like have that be a thing.
Let's have bizarre celebrations. Let's forget who forget, why forget where. We'll have bizarre celebrations. I play the satyr in Cyprus, you the bright being strip bare.
Of Montreal followed Satanic Panic with 2005's The Sunlandic Twins, an even deeper excursion into disco bass lines, dancey programmed beats, and Barnes's unique sensibilities for angular melodies and layered Bowie-esque vocal harmonies.
After we did Satanic Panic, I had so many new ideas right away, and I wanted to start working on Sunlandic Twins right away. And that was also around the time where my wife had gotten pregnant, and so there was all that, the chaos and the craziness and the anxiety of that. And so there's just seemed like there's always something going on in my life that kept me in this weird state of turmoil, but also this state of being hyper alert and alive. I feel like for a while I was numb, and then all of a sudden I just got shook so hard and woken up. And luckily I was able to stay focused and keep producing music and not get overwhelmed by the adult realities.
In the years that immediately followed signing with Polyvinyl, Barnes was on an astonishing creative hot streak that yielded a ceaseless flow of amazing music. Along with proper albums Satanic Panic and the Sunlandic Twins, Polyvinyl released multiple EPs, collections of unreleased material, singles, and reissues of earlier work from Of Montreal, all while the band kept to a non-stop touring schedule that saw them playing to larger and larger audiences.
It seemed like we had reached the end of what we could have possibly accomplish commercially before we signed to Polyvinyl. And I think everyone just felt like we were putting in so much effort, so much work, and we cared so much about the stuff that we were making, but it just wasn't connecting with people. And so it definitely felt like I'd paid my dues, but my dues hadn't paid me. And so I didn't really know what to do. But then when Satanic Panic came out and people seemed to enjoy it, and it was like, well, this is actually something, this is cool, because I'd never experienced it before. I'd never experienced people like buying tickets in advance or even playing to a large audience or anything. It's usually just like a handful of people just milling around in the club while we were playing and not really paying attention. And yeah, that was my first taste of that kind of thing, where it seemed like people were actually excited to hear what we were doing, excited to see us perform. And I'd always had this like theatrical side to me, but I was basically just doing it for myself because no one seemed to really vibe with it that much. But then with Satanic Panic in the Attic and with Sunlandic Twins and Hissing Fauna, definitely got more deeper into the theatrical side of things and exploring that side of my stage personas and that side of my psyche. And yeah, the whole thing, it's just like a really magical combination of getting that positive affirmation from the outside world and also being ready to do something more glamorous and more exciting for people to be excited about.
Of Montreal was reaching thousands of new listeners in this time, and many of them were being inspired for music of their own. Here's Generational's Ted Joyner.
We saw Of Montreal so many times. I remember being at one of their shows and just turning to the person next to me and saying, "This is my favorite band on the planet." And the person was like, "I don't know you, like, please don't talk to me." But it was like, I remember being so excited about them. We got to meet them much later on, but Grant and I were at all of those shows without exception. Like any show they were playing during that time, we were there.
Here's Caro Bonito's Gus Lobin.
Yeah, I don't know if that's the difference between like me and Jamie, like me listening to like crazy twee acoustic music with like penny whistles and shit in it, and then Jamie listening to Of Montreal's psychedelic swag, and then like somehow that combination is us making music.
Chemicals don't strangle my pen. Chemicals don't make me sick again. I'm always so dubious of your intent. Like I can't afford to replace what you spent. Come on, chemicals. Come on, chemicals. Come on, chemicals.
In January of 2007, Polyvinyl released Of Montreal's Hissing Fauna, Are You the Destroyer? The album was instantly recognized as a masterpiece, bringing together the whimsical pop-funk musings that Barnes had been exploring on the past two albums with some of their most engaging production, and a near-perfect balance of unshakable hooks and raw lyricism dealing with autobiographical themes of romantic anguish and mental health struggles. The album took both Of Montreal and Polyvinyl to a new level of commercial success. The band blew up. They played Coachella that year along with their increasingly packed headline tours, and in April of 2007 they performed on Late Night with Conan O'Brien, making them the first Polyvinyl band to play on late night television. Hissing Fauna quickly became the best-selling release on the label, a distinction it holds to this day. Here's Matt Lunsford.
Satanic Panic came out, and then Solenic Twins came out, and then Hissing Fauna came out, and then Skeletal Lamping came out. And that was all between 2004 and 2009. And so that was just like an incredible period because Montreal's output was not slowing down, and they were touring constantly, and every record was being so incredibly well received that it just like catapulted the label.
Kevin Barnes.
It's just very exciting. It felt good to be one of the bigger bands on a label and to have that excitement and to have people from the label like coming to the shows and experiencing it with us and knowing that we're all working together. Like we had a longtime publicist named Frank Nieto that worked with us for a long time during those years, and he would come to the shows, and so it just like felt like a family in a lot of ways. When something exciting would happen, we'd share with each other, and so it was cool. It didn't feel icky at all. Like it felt like this is cool. This is exciting for all of us.
By the late 2000s, a huge percentage of music fans had shifted from physical to digital listening. With 2008's Skeletal Lamping, Of Montreal and Polyvinyl experimented radically with the release format, challenging the very idea of what releasing music meant in the file-sharing era.
Kevin came to us and said they wanted to do a collection of non-physical format music that was still music. So suddenly we're making t-shirts with like the album download attached, and we're making
table centerpieces.
Yeah, table centerpieces with the album attached, and like clings that you put on your wall, and a giant horse poster, and like these like lanterns, and all like an entire merch line, which definitely was very much a reaction of the times in which downloading was becoming so prevalent, and it felt like still having some sort of physical form attached to the record was something that they really wanted to lean into, even if it wasn't an LP or a CD. And we ended up making that entire collection completely DIY. Like we're trying to source like how to make these very, very like unusual types of products and sourcing them from like directly from, factories overseas and stuff like that. It was a project that lasted for like an entire year and finally like culminated in the Skeletal Lamping collection, which is, I think it was like 11 merch pieces total.
People were getting more into downloading records and at that point too. And so it felt like, why do we need to just be trapped in this kind of old way of thinking when you could open your mind up a bit and be like, okay, you want the music, of course, but then the packaging that comes with the music can be anything and doesn't have to be a CD, doesn't have to be vinyl, doesn't have to be a cassette or whatever. It could be anything. It could be a t-shirt. It could be, like the Chinese lantern. It could be the wall decals. And really it's just wanting to make more art, wanting to create more things with my brother and with my wife at the time, Nina, and just feeling like kind of the sky's the limit and feeling that was another great thing working with Polyvinyl is that a lot of labels be like, oh, that's like cost prohibitive, or there's no way we're going to make enough money off this. It's just stupid. Let's not do it. That they were like so on board, no question. Yeah, let's do it. This is exciting. So I think that things like that made us feel even more invested emotionally, knowing that if we had some crazy idea that they wouldn't just disregard it, that they'd help us try to create it into the material world.
Yeah. So how did that go?
Yeah.
So,
how did it go?
as you might imagine, it was super challenging for record stores. That was not an era yet in which record stores were ready to look for like a non-CD LP piece to bring into the store, except maybe t-shirts. Looking back, it was really ahead of its time. Like now, obviously, artists making like weird merch is pretty normal. Record stores weren't really ready for it. People were buying that stuff on tour a lot, and it did well. Kevin brought this vision, and we brought the entire vision to life. And it was still super successful. We sold out of all that stuff we had. You know, we're not like sitting on a warehouse full of it or anything. It's all long gone. Like it did well, and it's...
I do remember, though, working on that centerpiece, we had to sit there and try to figure out how it would be easiest to put it in the box and how you would fold it to make it easy for the customer. We want to be a label where our bands can be artistic and they can do what they want their record to sound like and look like.
Even if we were like a decade early.
Of Montreal performed on Late Night with David Letterman in 2008, continuing the flurry of excitement and activity that they'd been riding upwards since signing with Polyvinyl 4 years prior. Even though the years surrounding Hissing Fauna saw Of Montreal at the summit of their mainstream popularity, Kevin Barnes never tried to take the band to a different label, or move from their home on the fiercely independent Polyvinyl to a major label with bigger budgets and more resources. Of Montreal continued working with Polyvinyl in the years that followed, regularly releasing new music as Kevin's muse has continued to shift over the years. Here's Kevin speaking to why they've stuck with the label through all of it.
I'd heard so many horror stories about people signing to major labels and then losing creative control, and I knew that you weren't going to force me to do anything that I didn't want to do or make me feel like I was just lost in the shuffle. Like, it was more important to me to have that personal one-on-one connection with my label and to be with people that I trusted and respected and know that they respect me and trust me. And because, yeah, we did have a couple people from a couple different major labels approach us, but I don't know why, even from an early age, I always felt suspicious of the major label world. And even though like we did like some commercials and we were sort of embraced by the mainstream kind of like corporate world for a second, I always felt like I was just dipping my toes in it. I never wanted to stay there, even though, you know, it's easy to say like you don't want something if it's not going to happen anyways, but like I never really wanted to like win Grammys or like be that kind of like Bruno Mars type of artist. I identified more with the more sort of underground, obscure, freaky people, and I knew that if I stayed with Polyvinyl that you guys would allow me to explore my own path and not give me shit to be more like Hissing Fauna or more like whatever. Like I wouldn't have to reproduce anything. I could always just continue moving forward as an artist and not have to feel self-conscious in any way.
It's so interesting too because you were able to stay completely true to whatever your creative vision was at a time, and you still have worked with Grammy caliber level collaborators and people who have probably taken away. Think about Liz Solange, contribution to False Priest, and Janelle. Those are names that like moms and dads know.
I kind of had this realization, like if I was going to write songs for another artist, like a more mainstream artist, I wouldn't want to try to write the hit single. I'd want to write the weird song that was like track 7 or something. Like that's my comfort zone. To do the thing that's like the kind of the oddball song amongst all the other songs. Even though I have a ton of respect for the hit makers, like Pharrell or ABBA or the Beatles or whoever, like people who can write like big popular international hits. I think that's like an insane talent. But every time I tried to do that, it's so stupid. It sounds horrible. It's ridiculous. And so I just know I can't do it. The only thing I can really do with any success is just doing exactly what my mind is wanting to do. Like I can't really force anything to happen because it always comes out so awkwardly.
That's evidenced not by track 7 caliber, like mainstream bids, but more like that every record you've done, pretty much every record you've done ever has been such a wildly different character than the last.
Yeah, often the record that I make is on some level influenced by the record that came before it. I think that Skeletal Lamping was very much influenced by the attention that we were getting around Hissing Fauna, because I was like, okay, cool, I got your attention now, I want to show you what else I can do. And I think that's been a part of it, is I want to show you what else I can do. Like I can make Hissing Fauna, okay, cool, I'm not going to make it again, because I've already shown you I can do that, but I want to show the world that I can make a Skeletal Lamping, I want to show the world that I can make a False Priest, and a Pair of Lyrics Dogs, and whatever. So I think that, yeah, like there's a bit of that in me of wanting to show the world other things that I can do, and not wanting to just reproduce the same thing. But then also with Skeletal Lamping, it's like, all right, well, let's see if you'll go there with me. Let's see if like you are open to hear something maybe less immediate or like less accessible or whatever. I love being able to like still be like a DIY type of band and, you know, not feel like we don't have to like get any like corporate sponsorships or whatever, you know. It's not like, okay, so you guys gotta get Honda on board for this tour that you're doing or whatever, you know.
Of Montreal's first few years on Polyvinyl were prolific and hardworking, but they were also having a lot of fun.
There was this remix project that Polyvinyl was doing where we were trying to get the fans involved and to say, okay, anybody that wants to turn in this remix of the song, I think it was Famine Affair, maybe from False Priest, and just to see, it's basically like if you win the competition, you get free passes to see a show or something. And there wasn't a lot of people that were doing it, and our tour manager, who's like one of my best friends from childhood, created this persona and made the worst remix possible, just like intentionally horrible remix that had like Titanic sample, like from the movie Titanic, like samples from the dialogue in that movie, and just the worst like stock GarageBand samples that just come with GarageBand, like this kind of Seinfeld sounding slap bass, and just the song went on for so long with like pauses with nothing happening, and then the remix would kind of
was it like
pick back up
EDM style, or was it like just non-music nonsense?
It was actually it was non-music, but it was actually on a lot of levels it was better than the things that were like kind of more professional sounding, just because it was like so abstract and so weird, and nobody would ever think, oh, this is good music, but it's just so funny and just so crazy and stupid sounding. And we were supposed to be the judges of who won the remix project, and we're really feeling that Simon Krendoff. His name was the guy's name was Simon Krendoff, and his project was called Simon Does. Yeah, so that was the thing, and we sent it to Seth, and he's like, I don't know, guys, I'm not really feeling that one so much. And we're like, what? Really? That's the best one. I think he deserves to win.
We're actually thinking that he should be on the label, and we should start talking
take him on tour.
I got prank emails from Simon for years after that, where they would not let down their guard that this was like an inside job, where it was just like, I would see them on tour. I was like, okay, which one of you is Simon who keeps emailing me? Because like they would know details about like my life, and it was just like, okay, which one of you is this?
So Simon's stalking you at that point, basically.
Simon was stalking me after the remix contest.
Oh yeah, we definitely, for like months, maybe even years, we would write Seth and say that we were Simon Krendoff and that we were coming into Champaign and we want to check out the offices, and knowing way too much information.
And now, in all of its truly incredible glory, here's Simon Does It All's remix of Famine Affair.
I love you, Jeff.
Don't you do that. Don't you say your goodbyes. Not yet. Do you understand me? You're to me now, Rose.
I promise. I will never let go, Jack. I'll never let go.
Polyvinyl exhibited throughout the 2000s would continue as the decade started winding down, and the way people listened to, talked about, and consumed music continued to change. In our next episode, we'll be tracking some of those changes, while we talk with Starfucker, Shushu, Japandroids, and other artists that were coming into the fold in the second half of the aughts and beyond. Looking so forward to seeing you all then. But in the meantime, please subscribe to the podcast to keep up to date as we release new episodes. If you can, leave us a review. It really goes a long way to help this podcast reach more listeners. Also, be sure to follow @Polyvinyl Records on socials and use promo code PVPodcast to save 10% on your next order from our web store at polyvinylrecords.com. Until next time, I'm your host Fred Thomas, thanking you so much for tuning in to the Polyvinyl Podcast. Stay safe out there and be kind to one another.